Hello and welcome. Today we're diving into a topic that, both fascinates and divides people like few others. The rapture. Is this a core foundational teaching from the Bible, or is it something that was invented much, much later? Let's get into it.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to break down what the rapture actually is, where the whole idea comes from, and then we're going to investigate a claim you hear all the time, that the entire concept was just made up less than 200 years ago. Is there any truth to that? Well, let's take a look.
Okay, so first things first. Before we go any further, we have to be on the same page. What are we really talking about when we use that word rapture?
At its absolute core, the doctrine of the rapture is about a future moment in time. It's the belief that Christ will return to gather up all believers, that's both those who have already died and those who are still alive, and take them from the earth to meet him in the air. That's the foundational concept we're exploring. Now, this quote right here from 1 Thessalonians is really ground zero for the whole idea. It contains the key phrase that the entire doctrine is built on, caught up. And that specific action, that catching up, is where the concept gets its name. Even though, and this is important, the word rapture itself isn't actually in this verse. And this is how we get there. The word's journey is pretty interesting. The original Greek word in that passage was harpazo, which means to snatch away or to seize. Now, when the Bible was later translated into Latin, that word became rapturo. And from rapturo, well, it's a short hop to the English word rapture. So you see, while the word rapture isn't in our English Bibles, the concept it describes, that idea of being caught up, most certainly is. And it's not just a one-off idea found in a single verse. The concept of a future gathering and a transformation of believers, well, it's supported by several passages. You've got the instantaneous change described in 1 Corinthians, Jesus' own promise in the Gospel of John. The idea is really woven throughout the New Testament. Okay, so if the event itself seems to be biblical, where does all the argument and disagreement come from? Well, it all boils down to one simple but incredibly profound question. When does it happen? This is the great timing debate. And this timeline lays it out beautifully. There are basically 4 main views, and they all pivot around a future 7-year period known as the tribulation. First, the pre-trib view says the rapture happens right before it starts. Then you've got mid-trib, which places it smack in the middle. The pre-wrath view sees it happening sometime in the second half. And finally, the post-trib view says it happens at the very end, as part of Christ's big final return. All right, time for a little historical detective work. We're going to zero in on the origins of that first view we mentioned, the pre-tribulation rapture, because honestly, it's at the heart of a huge historical debate. So here's a claim you will hear over and over again, that the whole idea of the church being taken away before the tribulation is a modern invention. The story goes that it was first pulled together and systematized by an Irish preacher named John Nelson Darby back in the 1830s. And the argument that follows is pretty logical. If the idea is that new, how can it possibly be an original biblical teaching? For a lot of people, that kind of settles the debate right there. But we have to ask the question, is that the whole story? Now, it's pretty widely held by church historians that the early church really emphasized enduring persecution, that the expectation was suffering before glory. And most of their writings do seem to describe a gathering that happens after a tribulation. But proponents of the pre-trib view, they argue that the idea has been around for much, much longer. So let's look at the evidence they point to. Okay, let's start with this absolutely fascinating quote from a guy named Irenaeus. He was a major church leader writing way back around the year 180 AD. That's more than 1,600 years before Darby. And look what he says. He directly connects the church being suddenly caught up with the start of the Great Tribulation. He says when the church is caught up, then there will be tribulation. Now let's jump forward a few centuries. There's a sermon, and it's attributed to a writer we call Pseudo-Ephraim, and it's even more direct. I mean, listen to this. It says, all the saints are gathered prior to the tribulation that's coming, and they're taken to the Lord so that they don't have to see the confusion about to overwhelm the world. I mean, that is a very, very clear pre-tribulational idea written way, way before the 1800s. And let's look at one more really powerful example. This comes from Morgan Edwards. He was a Baptist minister, a founder of what we now know as Brown University, and he was writing this nearly 100 years before John Nelson Darby was on the scene. And he clearly describes the saints being raised and changed when Christ appears in the air, and then ascending to paradise before the final events play out on earth. So here's the crucial point. While Darby for sure popularized and systematized this view, its supporters argue that the core idea itself has a much, much longer history. So that raises a question, doesn't it? Why would some theologians believe that God would remove the church before a time of intense trial? Well, the answer is often tied to a deeper biblical theme that gives us some really important context: the idea of a faithful remnant. Remnant theology is this theme you see running through the entire Bible from start to finish. And the principle is actually pretty simple. When the majority of people fall away or face judgment, God always, always preserves a small, faithful group, a remnant, to carry out his promises and his purposes. We see this illustrated so powerfully in the book of Revelation with the letters to the 7 churches. Just look at the stark contrast here. The Church of Philadelphia gets praised for its faithfulness, no rebuke at all. It's a perfect picture of a faithful remnant. But then you have the church at Laodicea, which is called lukewarm, uncommitted, a picture of compromise. And right here, this is where it all connects. The specific promise given to that faithful remnant church, the one at Philadelphia, is that Christ will keep them from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world. Now, pre-tribulation believers look at that and see a promise of removal from God's wrath, while post-tribulation believers argue it's a promise of protection through those trials, not necessarily removal from them.
Okay, so we've looked at the what, we've looked at the when, and we've dug into the historical origins. But with all these different views floating around, what's the most important thing to take away from all this? Let's zoom out for a second and focus on the common ground. You know, despite all the fierce debate over the timing, it is so crucial to see what every single one of these major views holds in common: that Christ will return, that believers will be given new, glorified bodies, that evil will not get the final word, and that his return is the ultimate blessed hope for every Christian. This, right here, is the bedrock of unity.
This is the absolute essential point to grasp. Scholars and pastors and believers can debate the exact sequence of events, and believe me, they do. But the certainty of the event itself, the glorious return of Jesus Christ, that is completely non-negotiable across the board. And that really shifts the focus, doesn't it? It moves us away from a purely academic debate about charts and timelines to a deeply personal and practical question. It's not about being right on the timeline, but about being ready in our hearts. Because in the end, no matter what your view is on the timing, this is the shared prayer that unites all believers, echoing the final words of the Bible itself. It's a cry of hope, of anticipation, and of readiness. Thanks for watching.